You're listening to the VSL Aviation Podcast, your source for practical aviation knowledge and Checkride prep. I'm Seth Lake, professional pilot, DPE, and Director of Operations at VSL Aviation. Tonight, we've got a great lineup, topics and questions. We'll start with a few quick congratulations to new pilot certifications. That's something new that I wanted to do, is we get shout outs on Discord of when people are successful, so wanted to share in the celebration with them. Then we are going to dig into some PIC, some logging PIC time in a TBM, how ForeFlight sources altitude winds, and a breakdown of who can log cross-country time and when. And then we're going to walk through a short, real-world scenario that follower sent in via email. He dropped a YouTube video of a landing at KVNY and whether or not he messed up there. He had a question. So we're going to watch that, and we're all going to critique him. And no, just kidding. We're going to look at it and see what could have done better, what we could learn from that. And then a quick refresher on weather symbols, if we have time. Then we'll open it up for Q&A. If you're watching on YouTube, drop your questions in the chat, or Instagram, drop your questions in the chat. And then if you're joining us on Discord, you can join live. Just raise your hand, and I'll pull you up at the end of the show. But John is going to feed any questions that come in from YouTube across there, so just type them out there. Before we get started, I want to introduce my producer, John, and co-host, really. He's a CFI, CFII, MEI, fast team representative up in the Northeast United States. He keeps the live stream running, manages the Discord, keeps me sane there, helping me manage all that, so I really appreciate it. What I have pulled up here is the April 16th live stream companion, and it's on the Discord. So again, the Discord server, if you want to join, it's not behind a paywall or anything. You can find the link on vsl.aero. I try to drop a link in all the podcasts, YouTube videos, Instagram, it's on there. So if you want to join us there, it's free to join. And there's a podcast companion that has links to basically all the stuff that we're going to talk about. So you can go over there. If you're joining us on Discord, kind of follow through. I'm trying to do a better job of keeping things organized on there. So both for the show's sake and also so you can follow along in the future. So what we're going to talk about first are congratulations. So I'm going to read these off. We have a congratulations going out to Dennis. He flies out of Van Nuys, got his private pilot. This came across on Discord. Another Discord user, Ro, just R-O, and he did his instrument with a friend of mine, Chip Gibson, who's a DPE in the Northwest Arkansas area. So I recognized Chip in his, celebration picture with his certificate. So it's good to see that I guess he's somewhere close to Northwest Arkansas. Then we had another Discord user, Magnetic Dip, finished his commercial. And one last Discord user of Zacklemore, I think that's right, commercial. And he's actually with us on the Discord, I think. Two more. I had Chris, who's a new friend of mine. He's a first officer with me here at Southwest Airlines, and he finished his CFI initial with me just a couple days ago. And Connor, who's a private pilot near my local airport. I did that at my home office there at Russellville, Arkansas. He finished his private pilot up on Monday after a discontinuance for some bad winds and other problems there. So congratulations to all those folks. And without further ado, we'll get started on our first question. This came across from user Kibbles. I don't know if they're with us in the Discord. Let's see. Kibbles, you here? I don't see Kibbles. But anyway, Kibbles asked a question regarding flight time. And this tends to be a pretty popular topic on the podcast. Whenever I talk about flight time, that usually something that gets a lot of views. And there's a lot of questions on it, obviously. And as we're going to dive in with another question that we have today, is that it can get really complicated. But Kibble's questions, he just stated, so I've been flying the right seat in the TBM and wanted to make sure I'm logging it correctly. The op specs are for single pilot, and the airplane is single pilot, and there is no PDP, and that's the Professional Development Program, which allows a Part 135 to let the right seater log SIC time in a single pilot aircraft. We've talked about that on a couple of other shows. So he didn't have that in the op specs. Clearly, I can't log anything on the 135 legs. However, on the Part 91 legs, can I log dual received? The PIC is a CFI. Appreciate the help. So this is actually pretty straightforward, something that I've actually done because I flew Part 135 in a single engine turbine aircraft, a turboprop, the Kodiak. And so on those Kodiak trips, it was actually really cool because I could take up somebody that was wanting to gain experience, and when we were on a air taxi leg, they could sit over there and maybe help with the radios and kind of crew resource management a little bit, but I was the PIC and pilot flying per our op specs. So I had to fly all the 135 legs. But if we were depositioning on like a Part 91 leg, because now we're no longer operating under 135, we're Part 91, I could actually let that pilot fly. And I'd have to clear everything with my director of operations or chief pilot. But most of the time, hey, they just wanted a name, pilot certificate number, make sure they were a commercial pilot, and they could fly the 91 legs without any problems. And in fact, they could log it as PIC even, because the Kodiak, as long as they had a high performance endorsement, single engine land, it's not even complex really, it's turbine, so it is sort of complex. But anyway, the right seater could log those hours. And definitely, as me being a CFI, I could give dual received and they could log it that way. So yeah, Kibbles, you could definitely log that. And I answered on Discord there that we could do that. But since they had the question, I thought I'd bring it up here because I thought that was a good one. If you have the opportunity to fly Part 135 in a single pilot aircraft, I think I would jump on that opportunity. Just be careful of how you're logging it. Don't log time on the 135 legs unless it's legal, allowed under the op specs. And then on the 91 legs, log it as long as you're appropriately rated in the category and class of the aircraft. All right, so that's the first question down. Next, I'm going to let John handle this one because the question came across on our commercial pilot forum on Discord. And there was basically a question about why do the winds aloft on the aviationweather.gov site, why do they differ slightly from the ForeFlight winds aloft? So if you get a briefing on ForeFlight and you look at the winds aloft there, they'll be slightly different. And John had a really good answer. I'm going to let him handle it. And I've got the link posted up right here that he wound up posting. So John, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Seth. So the question that was asked was basically, can I use ForeFlight's winds aloft data for a check ride, or do I have to use the original National Weather Service data? And my answer was that yes, you can use ForeFlight winds aloft data for your check ride because, in fact, ForeFlight is getting their data from the National Weather Service as well. However, what ForeFlight is doing is that in each individual point along your route, they are interpolating for you. They're doing the math for you, so they're finding that winds aloft at each individual waypoint, and they are supplementing the National Weather Service data with some computer graphical models or some computer-generated weather models that can help make it more accurate, ideally. So yeah, totally fine to use ForeFlight weather data for your check ride.
Perfect. Yeah. And if you wanted to look at that, the link you posted, that's in the support at foreflight.com. I'll actually copy this and we can just take a look at this for the podcast. A downside with how we're doing Instagram is Instagram's not getting any of the audio through Discord. That's a known issue. So sorry you're experiencing that on Instagram. That's just another reason for you to come over to Discord and you'll be able to hear all this. So that's the ForeFlight support page that I have pulled up here. And it basically has a in detail description of, how are winds aloft used in navlog calculations. Anyway, great answer, John. And for those of you on Discord or on Instagram, when you have these types of questions, this is the way that it should be handled. As a professional pilot, you have a question. I love having Discord as a resource for you to be able to hop on and ask a quick question. So I definitely don't interpret this as me saying, well, don't ask the question here. But a great way, especially if you're looking to be a CFI someday, is to slow down before you ask the question. Go out and find some resources. Look on ForeFlight, look on, the FARs, the AIM, wherever. Try to do some searching there, some self-education. Then if you find the answer, instead of coming to Discord or somebody that you're asking the question to, instead of coming to them with a question, you come with them with, hey, here's what I found. Can you correct me if I'm wrong in the way I interpret this? And I think that's a really professional way to handle questions like these. So not talking down to people asking questions on here, but I really like, especially when I see CFIs answering questions like this. That's the way, this is the way, that's how we do it. Okay, so now we're going to go back to Discord on the screen because we had a question from Katie. And this question was, again, in regards to hour logging. So y'all can see this here. Katie asked the question, I have a follow-up question after listening to the most recent podcast of the episode. I'm not going to read through it. She made a really good post. I'm not going to read through all of it. Basically, on a recent podcast, we talked about how you needed to be the pilot flying for the takeoff and the landing in order to log that time as cross country. And I do recall saying that. I'm sure I've said that. I know I've probably posted answers on Discord, maybe even Reddit, about saying, yeah, you need to be the pilot flying for the takeoff and the landing. The reason I say that most of the time is there are two legal interpretations that kind of talk about this. So we're going to pull up both of these LOIs. They're both part of the ACE guide in the LOI section. And so the first one is the Gebhart 2009 LOI. And this is, I would call this kind of the core LOI with this specific question of, can you log cross-country time if you weren't flying the airplane on that cross-country? But it's important to note that the Gebhart LOI and then later on the Hillard LOI, they're both from 2009 actually, but Gebhart must have happened first because in the Hillard LOI, they actually reference the Gebhart LOI. So they must, yeah, anyway, that's not really important. Both of those LOIs, though, discuss the logging of time by a safety pilot who's flying as a safety pilot with a pilot who's sole manipulator of the controls. So the basic question was, if pilot A, who's sole manipulator of the controls, if they take off and they fly to point B and they land, so pilot A flew from point A to point B, so they did a cross country, right? Can the safety pilot log that time as cross country? And both of these LOIs say that no, you have to have completed the takeoff and the landing in order for that to count as cross country time for the pilot flying. The Hillard LOI went further and to say, okay, well, let's say pilot A takes off and then switches controls mid-flight with the safety pilot. So now the safety pilot becomes the sole manipulator's controls, and the pilot that was formerly the sole manipulator becomes the safety pilot. So they switch roles mid-flight, and the other pilot does the landing. Who can log cross-country time there? Do they split the time? Does pilot A log all of it, pilot B log all of it? And the Hillard LOI said neither one of them can. Neither one can log cross-country time because neither one did both takeoffs and landings. And 6165, specifically the 6165 cross-country requirements, the FAA interprets as they want a single pilot to do the takeoff and the landing. So the question, now that I've described the answer there, maybe I didn't do this in the correct order. The question Katie had, which I thought was a really good question, it brings up a lot of interesting things to ponder, is let's say you're outside the pilot, safety pilot realm, and you're a pilot, a student pilot, or a pilot receiving instruction and an instructor. Can the instructor, who is not sole manipulator of the controls, right? They're just on board giving instruction, qualified instructor, they're giving appropriate instruction, all that stuff. Can they log cross-country time? So the student is doing the takeoff, the student's doing the landing, the instructor's not doing the takeoff or the landing, but the instructor is instructing. So can they log cross-country time? That was the question. Basically, John and I talked about this a little bit before we came on the show. I think, but both of us are kind of thinking yes, that's appropriate, that the instructor can log cross-country time as well as the student, because both of those legal interpretations, remember, were specifically targeted at the safety pilot-pilot relationship. They didn't talk about instructors at all. And they were also talking about the instrument requirements, right? They weren't talking about anything else. It was very targeted at the instrument requirements. And that's how legal interpretations typically work, is they're very targeted at a specific scenario. And even the FAA will tell you to use caution when you're applying LOIs outside of that specific scenario. They may not apply. So what would be it kind of went down the rabbit hole of a thought experiment. As let's say the FAA comes out tomorrow and they say, no, full stop. In order to log cross-country time, you have to have done the takeoff and the landing. Well, that right there is a little, they couldn't really say that because not all forms of cross-country time require a takeoff or landing, right? Just those required for the private instrument commercial require takeoff and landing. The ATP cross-country just requires you to fly to a specific point that's greater than 50 miles and back. You don't have to land there, right? So that brings up another question. Well, who has to fly, right? If you weren't the pilot flying for 51 miles, do you get to log that time, towards the ATP, it gets really confusing really fast. So I think if we don't read into it too much, and we just take the FARs as they stand at face value, which there's also a FAR that allows you to log time. If you're an instructor providing instruction, the FARs say that you can log that time as PIC. So since you're logging the time as PIC, your student is the sole manipulator. They may or may not be PIC. That kind of doesn't matter. They're the sole manipulator. I think you can still log that time. Now, the other thing I would bring up that maybe muddies the water a little bit more is that's not true for every event, right? I can log cross-country time as an instructor if my student is the one executing the cross-country, but if my student does a landing, I can't count that landing as my landing. I have to be the sole manipulator to do that. So we're kind of back to, well, maybe there is some precedence here to say that you couldn't log that cross-country time even if you're an instructor. But where I'm at now, unless somebody can find a legal interpretation to prove me wrong, is that yes, if you're providing instruction, you can log that time as cross-country that you're giving your student, even if, you're not the sole manipulator of the controls for the takeoff and the landing. But if you're a safety pilot, don't log cross-country time, right? If you're up there time building, and this happens a lot, right? You're between your instrument and commercial, you're trying to get the total hours up, and you're building time with a safety pilot. You both can split PIC. Y'all can do the dual log PIC scheme that we've talked about on here, but you can't dual log cross-country time in the environment, of a safety pilot and a pilot. So hopefully that was clear as mud and caused no more confusion. I'm sure everybody...
And just to bring it back to Katie's point, both pilots in a dual receive scenario can actually log this as cross-country regardless of who does the landing. That's not the case for the safety pilot relationship, but in the case of that instructional relationship...
Yeah, agreed.
The instructor could do the takeoff and the student could do the landing, and that's totally kosher for both of them logging cross-country time.
Yeah, and that, I don't see any reason why they couldn't log that as well. Now, ideally, you'd be letting your student do the takeoff and landing too, so that's maybe a different point. But yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, because I don't think the LOIs that I used to answer that question were applicable here. So I was wrong. I don't think they were applicable. And the reason I thought I was wrong, or think that I'm wrong, is because of what I just talked about. If you were to go back and remove that requirement, then other than the ATP cross-country time, there's probably thousands of cross-country hours, millions of cross-country hours that would just have to be wiped off the books, that were not valid. And I guess you could put something in an LOI that's saying from this point forward, it's not retroactive, but it would get really ugly really fast. There'd be thousands of hours that people just can't log cross-country anymore if you made some sort of rule like this, especially in the instructor-student relationship kind of role. Okay, thanks for getting me on track there, John. I was scared to talk about that. I still am a little uncomfortable. I like to be more comfortable with references that I'm giving, but that one I just don't have any LOIs to point to. The FARs aren't specific, right? The FARs don't say, hey, you have to do the takeoff and landing. So barring some FAA kind of axiom saying that, yes, when we say a flight to point A, we just assume that the pilot logging the time is the one that did the takeoff and the landing. So, all right, that's that. Next, we are going to get to a video. So I'll read the scenario first, and then we'll play the short video. This came through email. It said, hi, I'm a student pilot. Recently was practicing my landings at FMY, KFMY, it's down in Florida, my home airport. As I proceeded to exit the runway, my instructions were exit Alpha 3 to taxi Alpha to runway 5. And I'll pull up the diagram here in a second. It'll make sense. My understanding, once crossing the hold short line, you're supposed to stop, clean up the airplane, and then proceed. If there is another aircraft traveling on said taxiway, you are to wait, then continue. This was my scenario. I waited to be on the safe side of things, and Tower advised me to continue and not make up my own instructions. Here's a link to a short video, said scenario. Please, if I'm wrong, tell me so. All right, so let's pull this up. All right, so first, let's look at, this is the taxiway diagram here. So we're assuming that the pilot just landed on runway 5, and then they cleared at Alpha 3. And then we're told to taxi Alpha 3, Alpha back. So they're just making a loop back to runway 5 to do more takeoffs and landings, right? That's the assumption. They didn't tell me that, but I'm just assuming that. So the taxiway diagram, we can't see the hold short bars, so I think those are important. So I got Google Maps pulled up, and very ironically, there is an airplane on the Google Maps image exactly in the location that this guy is describing himself in. So either it's a coincidence or this picture was taken and this is the actual student right here. That'd be funny. So you can see that this hold short bar to clear the runway is pretty close to the taxiway. So I think that's important because this is basically where that student stopped, is right here in that position. Very helpful, whoever did that. So now let's watch the video.
On tower.
Successful, Quebec, taxi Alpha, and Alpha to runway 5.
Alpha 3 to Alpha, runway 5, 41 Quebec.
For 8 Sierra Tango, runway 5 on course, clear for takeoff, assess traffic 2 mile funnel.
So you can see the hold short bar right there, he just crossed, and he starts the turn and stops. And he didn't say where the other aircraft was, he just said maybe it was on Alpha.
Successful, Quebec, would you please turn on Alpha?
Waiting for the aircraft to pass.
That's not your instructions.
Yes, sir, sorry. Going. Student pilot just trying to be safe.
I understand, but I'm issuing you control instructions, sir. Don't make up your own, please.
All right, so a little bit of chastising there. The controller I thought was pretty gentle, but it's never fun to get critiqued on the radio like that, especially if you're out there as a student pilot and you're just doing your best and maybe misunderstood a little bit. So he asked for my critique. Here's my critique. If there was a aircraft coming down Alpha and Tower wanted you to hold short and wait for that aircraft to pass, Tower would have told you that, or ground, whoever you were talking to at this point. Sounds like it was Tower combined, maybe. Tower could have been a little bit better and say you're, pass in front of the aircraft on Alpha to make it a little more clarifying. That's a common taxi instruction that I'll get, flying professionally at a busier airport where ground or whoever's controlling me will say, hey, you're going to give way to Spirit and then go behind, taxi to follow Spirit, give way to them. Or, hey, you're in front of the American. I need you to give, post haste, move quickly, get in front there because American's waiting on you. And they'll say, hey, the traffic on Alpha is holding short for you. So Tower could have said that. Maybe they were busy and just couldn't get that out. If we have some controllers on, maybe they can jump in, raise their hands here on Discord and correct me if I'm just talking wrong. But I think that's what Tower was getting at, is that because you had already crossed that hold short bar, you're now kind of in the way of the person on taxiway Alpha. So they can't really go in front of you because you're in their way. And you're just hanging out there. And he didn't tell you to stop. He didn't tell you to hold short. So his instructions, if he would want you to hold short for that aircraft, is he would have told you to do so. So since he didn't tell you to do that, he was expecting you to just go. So that's that part. I think, yeah, the Tower was right. You were incorrect in this instance. Now, I empathize with the fact that you were wanting to be safe because you're like, okay, I'm a new pilot. I need to stop and clean up this aircraft because my instructor doesn't want me distracted as I'm taxiing. And that's 100% correct as well. So this is a great opportunity to see where you had to make a decision for maybe an event that you hadn't trained for. So this is a great example of where decision making comes in. So if we could rewind this, or you find yourself in this situation again, is you have to make the decision of, okay, I'm just not going to clean up the aircraft. I got flaps hanging out. I might have a light on that I don't want on. I haven't completed my after landing checklist, but the aircraft's secure, it's safe. Tower wants me to move, so I'm going to move. And I'm not going to deconfigure the aircraft. I'm going to stay focused on taxiing until I get to a point where I can stop and I can complete the checklist. And that's just a decision that you have to make. You could have also made a decision of letting Tower know that I'm going to need a minute once I clear the runway, because then ground or Tower could have given instructions to the aircraft that was maybe waiting on you that you were obstruction for. But you either should have just delayed that checklist completion, or you should have communicated that you couldn't comply with those instructions, at that time because of whatever reason. So those are your options there. Pretty easy, but I wanted to talk about that. All right, and then the last question, I'm just going back to my list of what I said I was going to talk about. Weather symbols. That's what we were going to talk about. So we had a question, I think, last week on a weather symbol too. I don't think I put this in here. Let me find it real quick. Okay, so on the Discord, we had Evil FL Studio asked, what does this picture mean here? So I didn't share the right screen. Dang it. Okay, here's the symbol in question. So it looks like half of it looks like a backwards sideways S with a red dot in it. And it's up in North Dakota. And it's on this GFA, a graphical weather forecast. So that's where it's at. I'm going to jump over to this message because I answered it with a link. We're going to click on that link. The aviationweather.gov. This is the help center. And I'll show you how to navigate there, but you can just go to Discord and get to the actual link. And so the question or the symbol in question is like 4 down right here, and it's freezing rain. So freezing rain, definitely an important symbol. Good catch there on the map. And it makes sense. It's in North Dakota. It's with some other weather up there. So that symbol is freezing rain. Now, you're only going to see those symbols on kind of those older weather charts. And I don't know that a lot of pilots are using those. So it's good that you're using all the resources there. But I see these symbols, and I think these are like old school weather charts that meteorologists use to kind of communicate with one another. Us pilots, we're typically using the ones with like bright colors and pictures and layers on ForeFlight. This is not something that you're going to run into every day. And that made me think, well, hey, posting a link to where these symbols are would be really good, because if I'm weak on it, I didn't know that was freezing rain. I had to look it up. So if I didn't know that, then there's probably a lot of people that didn't know that and aren't familiar with all of these symbols that are on this website here. So a link will be in the description of the video here as well, or on Discord, and you can find all those long lost symbols there and refresh yourself on that. This Reddit post is from 6 hours ago, operating with Inop ADSB. And so this Reddit user had a UAvionics Echo, and they got a letter from the FAA saying that the ADSB is no longer compliant due to a non-functioning barometer source based on a failed flight I made last Saturday. So the FAA has an automated system. If you go up with a non-compliant ADSB, it'll hit the ADSB system. The ADSB system will see your registration. It will send a letter to the registered owner of that aircraft, and you'll get it in the mail. It's actually really efficient. So yeah, you could just get a letter in the mail from the FAA that says, hey, your ADSB is broken, and that'll be the first you hear about it. ATC might let you know as well, but that sounds like that's what happened to this user here. So they were asking it's going to take a while for them to get it fixed, so can they go fly? Because they have a Mode S transponder, and if they stay out of airspace that requires an operable Mode S transponder, or no, I guess their transponder, their GTX 330 is working. It's just not compliant with the UAvionics ADSB solution because of some paperwork issues. So they have a working transponder. Can they go fly with that working transponder and just turn ADSB off? And some of the answers were interesting, because the answers said, yeah, you can, but you're going to need to get a waiver, basically a waiver. And if you're interested in how to do that, you can type in FAA ADSB, I think it's just waiver. Yeah, there you go. And that'll take you to the ADSB deviation authorization pre-flight tool, your ADAPT. And I've gone over this on a podcast before, but you can put your flight information in here and get an automated deviation request if you don't have ADSB. The problem is, I don't think that's a valid answer for this specific problem. And the answer might be a little more complicated than you think. The reason that we can't get an ADSB deviation request is because this ADSB is installed on the aircraft, right? So now that means we have an STC on board the airplane. We've changed our type certificate. We've supplemented it with something else that we've installed. And within that STC, there's instructions called the ICA, which are instructions for continued airworthiness. So the ICA for this UAvionics is going to say that you have to have an operable and approved transponder. And so they don't, right? That transponder doesn't work. So I don't think that I think they're grounded. Unless they remove the ADSB, just take it completely off the aircraft and make the appropriate entry, which didn't sound like that was not the option they were wanting to go for here. So because their transponder now isn't compliant, the ADSB doesn't work, and because of that, it's like a catch-22. You can't go. So unfortunately, even with the ADAPT tool, I don't think they could probably file an ADAPT request, and since it's automated, it would get approved, and that might, that might hold water if you were needing to fly somewhere to get this approved. But even in that instance, I might want to call the FSDO, just make sure, hey, is this ADAP solution the right solution for me? Something to think about there. An interesting problem, and just an example of how some answers on Reddit aren't exactly correct. So be careful when you get answers on Reddit. I'll try to make a post on here later today to give my 2 cents and basically say, hey, I think you'd be in violation of the STC if you did this, and it wouldn't be airworthy. All right, that's it. That's all I've got. So we've got 31 people in the audience on Discord. We got 6 people on Instagram. I'm gonna take one question that came across. I don't know if they're even still here on Instagram. Of course, somebody's already asked, "What's my booking look like for check rides?" Appreciate it. Appreciate the hustle. But Kersey807 asks, "With the TBM, do you need the high altitude endorsement since it's pressurized?" And yes, you would need the high altitude endorsement if you were going to act as PIC. Now, just logging PIC, you could still log PIC as sole manipulator because you hold the underlying category and class there of the single engine land. You could do that, but you couldn't act as PIC unless you were properly endorsed. And yes, that high altitude endorsement is for high altitude. Remember, it's not just for pressurization. So I believe the cutoff is 25,000 feet. So as long as the service ceiling is over 25,000 feet, that's when you need that endorsement. It is a little bit of a loophole because there are some planes out there that are pressurized that don't have an altitude above 25,000. So technically you could operate those without high altitude endorsement, I guess. I don't know that it'd be a good idea though. I think it's really important if you're in a pressurized aircraft, you have that high altitude endorsement. Okay, let's see over here on Discord. Katie, you're welcome for the clarification. I don't know if that qualifies as a clarification, but you're welcome anyway. It was a great question because it was like, this is a mind bender. Okay, Neo35, I have a question for Seth around simulated instrument time for IFR ratings. If you only need 15 hours with a CFI, is it legal to be under the hood with a safety pilot that only has a PPL? Just to confirm, this does not include approach procedures, just hood time. Yeah, unless I'm misunderstanding something you're asking there, Neo. Yeah, you absolutely could log simulated instrument time with a private, appropriately rated safety pilot while you're under the hood. That's totally fine. It's just you're going to have to get 15 hours with a CFII of training at a minimum. So obviously a private pilot couldn't do that. But yeah, if you just want to log your time towards the overall simulated instrument time required by 6165, you could definitely do that with a private pilot. Again, as long as they're
do
appropriately
approach
rated.
Procedures as well.
Oh yeah.
There's no restriction on doing approach procedures. It's just not training. Yeah,
exactly. I'm glad you clarified that there, John, because I missed that part because you seem to think, well, I could just do like straight and level flight and turns. I wouldn't do an approach. No, you can do an approach too. Now, what you can't do is you and another non-instrument rated private pilot, y'all couldn't go up and file an IFR flight plan and practice together, right? You couldn't do that. But practice approaches under VFR, as long as you're not filing IFR, you're not in IMC conditions, that would be really bad. You can't do that. But as long as you're just under the hood, just VFR practice approach, yeah, do that all the time. Shady asks, Shady Milkman. In regards to logging time in the TBM, is high altitude endorsement required? Oh, maybe you came over from Instagram. Cool. All right, so we already answered that one. Back to Instagram. I'm going to sound dumb, but how much knowledge would you require for someone to have about a magneto's operation for a commercial ride? No, that's not dumb. I mean, the basic knowledge of a magneto I would expect you to have is, do you know the basic principles of how a magneto works and its potential failure modes? So knowing that there's two magnetos, that they're independent of the electrical system, that you might have a partial power loss if you lose one magneto, that you can troubleshoot the magnetos by isolating the left and right magneto. So in flight, right, if you have a really rough running engine, I would want you to know as a commercial pilot that you could reach down and you could go, instead of both, go left, go right, back to both, see if that changes anything, right? Another thing I might ask as a commercial pilot, if you don't demonstrate it during the flight, is when we come into parking and you shut down, if you don't do a hot mag check on shutdown, I may ask you, hey, what's a hot mag check? And how could we check to see if we had a hot mag? How would we do that? And so if you're not doing this, public service announcement. Start doing this. When you pull into parking and you're done, go back to idle. You want to do this quickly and carefully. You want to turn both mags off. Take the key before you pull the mixture, turn the switch all the way to the off position, and make sure that the engine starts to die. And you want to make sure you're in idle, right? Don't let it die completely. And then turn it back to both. That's the part you want to be careful with. If you slam that switch all the way back on like a Cessna, you're going to engage the starter and the engine's already moving, and that could damage your starter. So don't do that. But just do a simple hot mag check where you go from both to off, verify that the engine dies, and then back to both. And what you're doing there is you're verifying that you don't have a broken P lead. And so the P lead is what grounds the magneto to the airframe. And if that breaks, then there's no way for that switch to work, because what that switch is doing is it's grounding out the magneto. Well, if there's nothing to ground the magneto out to, that means it can't ground out the magneto. So that means when the switch is in the off position and there's a broken P lead, the magneto that has that broken P lead is hot. So it would be like leaving the key in the left position or the right position. So that means if you're not careful and you move that propeller and the impulse coupling activates, that it could fire the magneto and cause the engine to start inadvertently. That we might have drifted a little bit into CFI level of knowledge away from commercial level there towards the end. But being able to just discuss how that system works, like I just did, that's more than enough for commercial. I don't expect you to be able to overhaul a magneto, like take it apart and know all those. Even an impulse coupling, I don't know that knowing an impulse coupling makes you a better commercial pilot, or, how they work. Maybe knowing that it's there and, it kind of reduces wear and tear on the starter, makes it easier to start. Maybe that's worth it. But yeah, just the basics of, hey, two magnetos, independent of the electrical system, they have a backup, and here's how I troubleshoot them. That's what I want you to know.
I actually just sent you a link to University of North Dakota Interactive Trainer, and they have one on a virtual magneto that might be worth checking out to learn more about the magneto system. I probably would say that as a commercial pilot, you should probably know what like impulse coupling is and roughly what it does, right? And yeah, that like the P leads and the grounding, and like Seth was talking about, I would know that stuff.
Yeah, I doubt, I don't think I've ever talked about impulse couplings on a Checkride. Mainly not because I don't care. It's just there's probably more important stuff I need to cover during the oral. Again, I want to hedge what I'm saying there. Well, that doesn't mean that you don't need to go learn this stuff, right? There's only a certain amount of stuff I can evaluate in a 4 or 5 hour period during the Checkride. That doesn't mean that's the only stuff you need to learn, right? Go out and learn as much as you can. Learn and absorb as much information as you can. Just know that on the Checkride, it's physically impossible to evaluate all of this information. But that doesn't mean that you don't need to know it. So, yeah, that's cool. I'm going to bookmark this, and I'm going to put it in the podcast companion. And then if you're watching on YouTube or listening to a podcast at a later date, you can join the Discord channel and look it up there, or it'll be on the link of the podcaster video. So I've got that posted in the podcast companion. Oh, Adam G, trusted CFI of the Discord server. That is a coveted position. He just said that his student Jeremy just passed his IFR Checkride this afternoon. So Jeremy, congratulations. You had a good instructor. He's an active Discord user. So I am glad you're an active listener on here. So shout out to Jeremy.
Rapco says he currently owns a Cessna 150 and is wondering if you think it'd be a good idea to lease back his plane to the flight school he plans on instructing at. Do you have any opinion or ideas on that?
Yeah, I mean, you could. There's nothing wrong with doing that. What issue you're going to run into is there's going to be more wear and tear, right? So you can expect your maintenance costs to go up. What I would want is a clear contract with the flight school on that lease back of who's responsible for maintenance and what type of maintenance. All right. Sometimes those contracts will say that you as the owner are responsible for 100% of preventative maintenance, and then maybe even 100% of maintenance that's not planned for but maybe caused by the school. So I would want there to be some sort of cost sharing provision in there. If I was going to lease back, saying, hey, I understand that my plane could break and that's my responsibility, but if we both agree that it's probably because of the wear and tear that your school's putting it on, I at least want maybe a discount at your shop, or maybe some sort of cost sharing provision, or maybe a reduction in the amount that you're taking. So let's say the lease back is you're going to get 70% of everything. Well, maybe for, you can do a formula saying you get 85% in the event of some big unscheduled maintenance. So I would want to think about that contract there. I'm not giving out legal advice. I'm just saying here's what I would think about before leasing back to a flight school. Some things that I'd want to know. And then, of course, scheduling and stuff. If you wanted to use it, do you have scheduling priority, that sort of deal. So yeah, just make sure you have a good contract for it. It's a great way to defer cost. And then obviously you'd want to trust the flight school. If you trust the school and they manage the airplane well, it might be a great arrangement. There's a lot of people that do that. But if you don't know the flight school really well and don't have a good contract, then maybe do that first before you jump in. Neo 35. I have had a control instruction to hold before the short line for passing 777 in my little Cessna. I'm guessing the wing width. I mentioned that because it was an unusual request, but I complied. Yeah, I could see that, especially at the airport we were just looking at, is you could be asked to hold short before you cross the hold short line. And if tower's telling you to do that, then yeah, do that. They're preventing you from getting in front of that. But I could see how that would be uncomfortable. It's like, well, I'd still need to move forward to clear the hold short line. But if tower's telling you to do that, I would comply with them. Maybe just question and just say, hey, confirm you want me to hold here, or do you want me to cross the hold short line? Always, it doesn't hurt to ask. So don't worry about that. Fly with Abe. Are you able to do that on an Archer with toggle switches for mags? Yes. If you have toggle switches on a mag, so instead of the key, if you have toggle switches, you just toggle them both off and back on. It's even better because you can't inadvertently engage the starter, which is nice. You don't want to start the starter when the engine's running. That's really bad. Don't do that. All right, Hat on Discord. Can you act as a safety pilot in a high-performance aircraft without the high-performance endorsement? Yes, you can. Let me find...
However, you cannot log that as PIC time. That is SIC time.
Yes. Jaeger. A pilot gave me instruction in a PC-12. I have a private pilot in airplane single-engine land. I have 2 questions. Can I log dual received if I never touch the controls and only help with monitoring and changing the autopilot? And 2, can someone give instruction while flying as private carriage? That's a good question, Jaeger. So your first part, yes, you can. There's nothing that says in order to log dual receive that you have to be manipulating the controls. So in your case, you could log that time as dual received, airplane single engine land. You could do that. Yeah. I mean, frankly, there's nothing that says you have to have a private pilot or a ASCL to even do that. You can do that with a student pilot certificate, but you could log that as dual received. That's fine. The second question though is give instruction while flying as private carriage. That might be a confusion of terminology. And I think I've talked about this before, but I can't say it enough. AC 91 or AC 12012A that talks about private carriage. It is my least favorite AC. If the FAA is listening, I wish they would rescind it, because 12012A references parts of the FAR that mean different things now, right? The FAR has changed and the references no longer apply, and that AC is why everybody misdefines private carriage. So unless you're really talking about private carriage, which can really only happen under a Part 135 certificate, right? Private carriage isn't when Joe Bob, who bought a PC-12, hires you to fly him. That's not private carriage. That's just general aviation. That's just Part 91. That's a Part 91 operation. It's not private carriage. The reason people think it's private carriage is because of that advisory circular. The reason I know I've made the same mistake, and I'm getting off on a little bit of a tangent, but this is my soapbox here recently. I asked the air charter safety people about this specific question, and they were like, yeah, the private carriage is a Part 135 thing. Like, that's when you have a Part 135 and you have a private agreement between your 135 and a business, and you're only flying for them. That's private carriage. Because of that advisory circular, everybody misdefines it as like an operator hiring you to be a pilot. So anyway, your question 2, maybe all that was a tangent, wasn't even worth it, because yes, you can give instruction while in private carriage as long as it's outside that Part 135. So I'm assuming that you're meaning that this is just a Part 91 general aviation operation, in which case, yeah, there's no restrictions on giving instruction or not giving instruction in that realm. There would be potentially restrictions in the op specs that say, yeah, if you're 135 doing private carriage, you wouldn't be able to give instruction unless you were a company instructor, and there were some other things in place. Neo 35, another dumb question. There's no such thing as a dumb question. Is cross-country interpreted different for commercial time versus private? I was told that cross-country time was measured by airport to airport. After your PPL, you can log XC time by distance alone, with source and destinations being the same airport. So, no, I think let's pull up the regulations. So ecfr.gov, Title 14, Chapter 1, Definitions and Requirements. Oh, I think it's in 61, isn't it?
Yeah,
Going to
61.1.
the wrong part. Yeah. Subchapter D, Part 61, General Definitions. Now let's scroll down to cross country. Okay, right here. So this is subparagraph. This is under cross country time, subparagraph 2, for the purpose of meeting aeronautical experience requirements, except for rotor, for a private certificate, a commercial pilot certificate, or an instrument rating. So private, commercial, or instrument, or for the purposes of exercising recreational pilot. It must be conducted in an appropriate aircraft, includes a point of landing that's at least a straight line distance more than 50 nautical miles from the original point of departure, and involves the use of dead reckoning pilotage, yada, yada, yada. So not exactly. So your question is it different for commercial and instrument? And so the answer to that is no, it's not different. It's the same 50. It has to be at least 51 miles for that to count. Involve a takeoff and a landing. Where you might be confused on is it is different for other things. And so let's go down to, for the purposes of meeting aeronautical experience for airline transport pilot. And this is subparagraph 6. Conducted in an aircraft at least a straight line distance of more than 50 nautical miles from point of departure, and involves the use of dead reckoning pilotage, yada, yada, yada. So what that means is if you can log cross-country time for the purposes of the ATP certificate by just flying 51 nautical miles. You don't have to land. You just have to fly to a point that's greater than 50 nautical miles, straight line distance from where you departed from. That's the big difference. So private, instrument, and commercial have all the same definitions of cross-country. ATP is slightly different. So maybe that's what you heard, and you just misunderstood it as being for instrument commercial.
A new CFI had a question on this CFI interview, and that was, what would you do if a student keeps landing short on the short field landing? And I guess he's looking for your opinion on that question.
So they're always landing short on the short field?
Yep.
It's probably, I mean, without more information, I'd want to analyze their landing first. So I would want to analyze their landing from the base turn all the way through the flare. A lot of times what that might mean is they are not carrying enough airspeed on final, right? If they're maybe a little slow on final, low on energy, that could be the cause. I doubt that that's the case. If you're with them, hopefully you're keeping them on speed. The other thing that could be caused by is they're doing the power pull too early. So if you do the power pull and you still haven't started your transition, your round out, you do the power pull first and then start the round out, that's going to bleed a lot of energy off, or more energy off than doing the round out while you do the power pull, or doing the round out and then the power pull. So it's probably some combination of their left hand and the right hand not working at the right time. So that hand-eye or that hand-hand coordination between their left hand, their yoke hand and their throttle hand, some combination of those two, they're doing wrong. And so I would just say, hey, let's start the round out first and then start the power pull. See where that gets you. Just doing the power pull at a different time. I'm going to try that. Play around with it as an instructor. But that's kind of the fun thing about being an instructor. Somebody will struggle with something weird, and you've got to kind of dissect it to figure out, well, how do I fix this? But that's some tricks that you might not have tried. You can try those. Obviously, I like to try with my students to give them objective things like I just told you, rather than just tell them, will land better. Try to be as specific as you can. Give them something to do with their hands that you can objectively assess then. Because then you can say, well, no, you did the power pull the same spot. Let's try it again. Okay, now round out, now power pull, and see where that goes. Give it a try. All right, anything else on YouTube?
Yes. So, do you have any advice for a student working full-time about to start instrument training while working?
The normal stuff of, study. Obviously, you're watching some, I think, the useful media, staying involved, engaged through podcasts or YouTube videos. If you could get a simulator, I think that would really help. Proper use of a simulator, I think, is most advantageous for the instrument rating. And usually, especially if you're professional, you're working full time, maybe the time that you have available isn't a good time to fly. But it's always a good time to fly a simulator, right? If you have time, just go get in the sim. But make sure you're practicing correctly and good habit patterns. So if you can have access to a simulator, that would really help, especially in those periods where you may not be getting in the plane as much as you want. I think that would be a huge advantage. There's also, I talked about an app here on Discord. There's a lot of apps that help that I think are great, and they're either free or really cheap. So there's one, a VOR trainer. The VOR trainer app for your iPad is a great tool for you to master like how to enter holding patterns. And it just kind of gives you these little problems of holding patterns, and you can do iterations of them until you've mastered it. It's a really good tool. I use it to teach. So an app like that's good. Get the Garmin 650 app or Garmin 750 app. That app allows you to load instrument approaches in the 650 or 750, and it's touchscreen, works really well on an iPad. I think it's a free app. So even if you're not using a 650 or 750, you can use that app, and it helps you learn the sequence of like how to load an RNAV approach, how an RNAV approach looks in an FMS on the airplane versus how it looks on an approach plate. That can be useful. So there's all sorts of things you can do that don't involve necessarily flying the airplane. All right, Mike W. on Discord asks, I have an interesting thing that happened to me on a flight a while back. I was holding short and got cleared for immediate takeoff with traffic on final. So I got moving and then was immediately told to hold short. However, I was already rolling and I couldn't stop before crossing hold short line, so I told Tower that we had already crossed, and he sent the aircraft on final around. ATC seemed a bit annoyed. Could that technically be a runway incursion? I guess technically it might be a runway incursion. It might be worth an ASAP report or a NASA report. So if that was sometime recently, I would maybe talk about it via the NASA report. I don't think it's just, that's one of those things that happens. I had to go around today, and it really wasn't anybody's fault. ATC vectored me in kind of close to traffic, and I didn't have good spacing for landing, and they wanted me to go as slow as practical. They were asking them to clear the runway as fast as they could. They couldn't clear the runway as fast as they wanted, and so we had to go around. It's just one of those things that happens. Sometimes ATC is trying to work this puzzle piece, and they try to fit a little bit too much stuff in, and it doesn't work out as planned, and people have to go around. It's not going to be a runway incursion unless it was kind of a safety or loss of separation happen. Maybe ATC can jump in if we had anybody listening to answer that, but I don't think it's a big deal. Yeah, Rapco talked about chair flying is crucial for that instrument time. Yeah, chair flying, really important. That kind of goes back to the simulator. You could chair fly there. Pilot Lefebvre on Instagram, what are your thoughts on the Cessna instrument rating course syllabus and how it's structured for progress through the phase of instrument training? I don't have any specific thoughts on the Cessna instrument rating course. I've never even looked at that syllabus. I mean, I think Cessna has a good syllabus. If anybody's on here and can provide some feedback, I think their syllabus is pretty good. I don't know. I would imagine.
I'm pretty sure they just use the King School syllabus.
Oh, do they? Okay. Yeah, I mean, plenty of people have used that. But yeah, the main thing is I like to see people using a syllabus, so that's good. And especially if it's King School or ASA. ASA is the one that I like. I think ASA has a good syllabus. They have some really good products that I like to use. But, just be comfortable with it. It's a syllabus. Interesting question. This will be a quick answer from Instagram. The question was, is it possible to complete an instrument check ride with 3 RNAV approaches? It depends. Yes, but the RNAV, at least one of the RNAV approaches has to have a decision altitude. So basically an LPV approach. This used to be a requirement for a specific height above touchdown. The new ACS removed that restriction, and now it just has to have a decision altitude. So, or decision height. It might have both of those in there. But basically it needs to not just have an MDA. So that's an important thing to remember. The old ACS made you do, it was the non-precision approaches that were the problem. They had to be different nav aid sources, but that changed. It's a good question.
Basically, you need WAS.
Yeah, you need WAS. All right, Fly with Abe. Why isn't the power off 180 judged on something other than a point plus 200? I understand the idea as accuracy maneuver, but it's simulating an engine out. Wouldn't the runway be the goal? You know, I talked about this a couple weeks ago or a couple months ago now. It is kind of a weird maneuver. I wish we would change how we did this maneuver, because I think it puts us in a position as examiners, or it's a very black and white fail. So we might have a great applicant who's just a really good pilot and did awesome on the check ride, and they just messed up and they landed a little bit short. I can't give you any leeway. I have to issue a disapproval. I don't think that is doing anybody any good, really, right? I think you're still a good pilot, and then having that on your record, that kind of stinks. You know, I empathize with that. And so Jason Blair, he wrote an article about this. This is from maybe a month, 2 months ago. I don't remember, John. Maybe you remember the episode.
Yeah, I remember.
Anyway, another DPE wrote basically a blog article about this, about how he wished we would change it to maybe the first third, or make it a little more subjective, so we could evaluate, I think, what would be more fair. The devil's advocate standpoint, or the counterpoint to that argument, is that in a engine failure scenario, if I have a field to land in that's bracketed by trees, my ability to safely land in that field is really, really dependent on me being able to land as soon as after those obstacles, right, as possible, because I want to give myself the maximum distance to stop. And I may need 100% of that distance to stop. And so if I float at all in that engine failure scenario, I am going to land long. I'm going to have a lot of energy when I hit whatever's at the end of that emergency landing field. And that may be the difference between walking away and getting injured or worse. So being able to hit an aim point after an engine failure, I think is still that's an important skill. But what gets me away from that is there's a lot of important skills that we don't evaluate on a pass-fail basis in the check ride. So that, you know, we're kind of picking and choosing the what-if scenarios there. Because obviously that is an important one, though. So I think it's important for you to be able to hit an aim point with the engine out. I don't love the power off 180 because it results in a ton of disapprovals. Angel Antonio is just baiting me because they want me to talk more about AC 12012A. You're just trying to get me going. Let's pull up AC 12012A. Maybe the FAA is watching and I'm going to get a call from my managing specialist. Okay, here's some problems with AC 12012A that I have. So let's look at FAR. This is great content for a podcast, by the way, because I'm going to be talking about a bunch of regulations and reading them off the screen, and you're probably going to fall asleep. But if you're on the video, you can follow along with me here. So first problem, this bold section here, section 91-181 Charlie 1. That's one of the first FARs it references. So let's go to that section of the current FARs. So we go to subchapter F, 91, and scroll down to the 100 series and go to 181. So FAR 91-181, paragraph C1 does not exist. It's not in the current FARs. It's not even in the historical FARs that I can search on the ECFR website. I have no idea what that FAR is referencing anymore, because this AC was written in 1986. In 1986, maybe this made sense under the legal structure that was in place when the AC was written. This AC makes no sense anymore because it references things that I can't look at, and that's just not right, right? The FAA shouldn't expect us to use an advisory circular for information purposes when it references stuff that is incredibly out of date. So that right there, case closed. This is a bad AC because I can't verify, I can't understand what it's talking about right there because it's referencing FARs that don't exist. That's that right there. Before I get off on a tangent, and say more mean things about this advisory circular. I'll just end it with that. I have no problem with the general premise of this AC. I think it's important, and I wish the FAA would go in and update it with current information so we could actually see what they're talking about. So that's what I have to say about that. Now let's just look at, I said I would shut up, and I'm not shutting up. We're going to part 135, and we're going to word search private. Oh yeah, it's not in there. So part 135, or maybe it's under part 119. See, I should have just quit while I was ahead. All right, I'll prepare something more on this, but the part 119 is where you can go, and part 119 talks about private carriage. Private carriage is not something that can happen in part 91. It's just not. And if I'm wrong, somebody please correct me, but that's my understanding, is just private carriage can't happen in 91. So the majority of commercial pilots that are out there talking about private carriage are just misunderstanding, because this AC is really old and doesn't matter anymore. It's almost as old as I am, and I feel old. Fly with Abe on Instagram said walking holds is a really good way to understand them. I agree with that. You could walk. That's not chair flying. That's like walk flying. Alexandril, do I see the CFI? This is from Instagram. Do I see the CFII being converted to an ACS soon instead of the PTS? No, I don't see that happening soon.
Tony R on YouTube, do you recommend a safety margin on your height and speed while in an asymmetric thrust situation on final approach? Is there a reference like blue line plus 10 knots, height plus 100 feet till your committal height, etc.?
Great question. I would say hold blue line, and I wouldn't fly any faster than blue line unless there was another reason for me to fly faster, like some sort of gust factor. I would also not recommend crossing high, right? And we talked about this a couple of episodes ago too. We had a great discussion on, I think it was another advisory circular talking about runway overruns, right? There's been a few runway overruns, and we were talking about how all of these risk factors can stack together and cause you to have a long landing, an excess energy on landing, and exceed, have your landing distance exceed the runway available. And two of the things that it talked about was flying too fast and crossing the threshold height too high. Those all add percentages to your landing distance. So especially in the context of multi-flying, when we're typically flying a larger aircraft, and we're definitely training to go fly larger aircraft, I would not get in the habit pattern of being high and fast, especially because you're already a little bit faster, or you have less stopping capability because you have less drag devices out. And that's true for most, even larger aircraft that you go on to fly. Typically, let's say your airplane normally flies with 25 or 30 degrees of flaps on final. Well, in an engine out scenario, you might only go with 15 degrees of flaps, because if you try 30 degrees and you try to go around, you might not be able to go around. So we're already flying with less drag. That means our landing distance is going to be longer, right? And then our approach speed is going to be faster, which also extends our landing distance. And now if we start crossing the threshold a little bit higher, that's also increasing our landing distance. So it's a great example of how we're trying to be safe, but in an effort to try to be safe, we actually become more dangerous. And then back to what I was saying in the earlier podcast, those are all threats that we need to identify, and we just created more errors and threats, without identifying them. So now, even worse than having a threat out there that you know about, you've inadvertently created one that you don't know about. And basically, long story short, that habit pattern could cause you to have a long landing and run off the end of the runway. So I wouldn't recommend it. Blue line is fine. The drag demo that you're doing with your MEI in training, you should have confidence in the airplane at blue line. It is very common to feel uncomfortable at blue line and feel like you want to fly a little bit faster. Like, I'm just going to fly, 5 knots for the wife and kids. No, it's fine at blue line. It's perfectly fine at blue line. Don't need to fly a high final either. That's a common reason that I see people fail a multi-engine check ride, is they're high and fast and they get unstable. Well, guess what we can't do in a light twin? Going around is not really an option in a light twin. So if you're high and fast and unstable and need to go around, you can't. So you want to be as stable as possible. Be on speed, be on glide path. I would only add speed if it was gusty and I needed it. Or the POH said I needed to fly faster because I'm at a lower flap setting. Pibber23 off of Instagram, what should be a good focus area for multi-engine training that is not necessarily in the ACS. I think most of the stuff is in the ACS. Maybe another way to ask this is, what's something that I think is important that maybe isn't getting talked about enough? The VMC demo, I don't think gets enough love. I think a lot of pilots are scared of the VMC demo. And I think one of the reasons they're scared of the VMC demo is the training's not that great. I disagree with how the FAA wants us to do the demo, because essentially what they drive us to is we're doing a single engine power on stall, which is really dangerous, especially because the FAA is telling us to hold the wing, hold the 2 to 5 degrees angle of bank, which is going to cause us to have a great deal of aileron deflection at the top of this power on stall. So now you've got a dead engine and an aileron that has a lot of adverse yaw all on the same wing. So I've got a wing with really high angle of attack and a wing over here with really low angle of attack, and I'm approaching stall. I'm setting myself up for a spin. So it is really easy to get into a spin by botching up a VMC demo. And all of those instances where we see a plane roll inverted, a twin roll inverted after they lose an engine, that's because of aileron movement, really. The aileron, the pilot is trying to maintain wings level with aileron instead of the rudder, and it's causing a ton of adverse yaw, and it's aggravating the condition, and it's causing a spin. So a VMC is just a spin. And so that may be another thing that is a good focus area, is the VMC recovery is just a spin recovery, right? If you think about a spin recovery, it's pair. So power idle, ailerons neutral, rudder opposite, and elevator forward, right? So you're kind of doing all those things at once. If you think about the VMC recovery, right, power is coming to idle. We don't really talk about the ailerons, but they need to be neutral. Rudder is already opposite because you're stepping on the good engine. You shouldn't have any rudder into the dead engine, so rudder's opposite, and that's the way you're banking, so it's opposite of your bank. And then you're pushing the elevator forward. It's just a pair. VMC demo or VMC recovery is just a spin recovery. I think people would understand the VMC demo and recovery better if they connected the dots there. Do I have to do a DME arc for a CFII Checkride? No. Does it have to be published? If you do it, yes, it has to be published. Can I do 3 RNAVs approaches for the CFII? Yes. That's all from Instagram. So yeah, you can do 3 RNAV approaches. No, you don't have to do an arc. But if you do an arc, it has to be published. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, any YouTubers?
Yes, we have some more. Okay, this is an interesting one. Julian D. What is the definition of an equipment? I guess, like, what's the definition of aircraft equipment?
Okay. Well, anything that's installed on the airplane. First of all, I don't even know if I can find the definition for this. Let's look there. It might be in subchapter C, which is aircraft. I don't know. I could waste a lot of time potentially trying to find this definition. The way I would define equipment is anything that's installed on the airplane that isn't the part of the airframe itself. It's not part of the engine. It's not part of the propeller. Any of that other stuff is equipment. The other thing we could call them is accessories. Typically, when we're talking about accessories, we're talking about engine accessories. So you have the airframe, the engine, the propeller, and accessories. That's kind of how airworthiness directives define it. You could have airworthiness directives on those 4 category of things. So maybe that would be a good definition.
Okay, Flying with Mad Max on YouTube. He had a flight where he had flight following, and they canceled while he was still high and in the Charlie. If they cancel while you were in the Charlie, are you still good to be in the Charlie?
Man, I swear this has come up before, maybe on an opposing basis. I'll have to look this up.
Actually,
I think there was a discussion.
Yeah, it's actually this week's episode, I believe. It was kind of similar-ish, and they discussed, do you need to be on flight following within the Charlie? And the answer is no, you do not need to be on flight following within the Charlie. So, however, did they also give the frequency change approved? He doesn't say, but what do you think there?
Yeah, I would think you're fine because you really need that two-way radio communication to enter the Charlie. It doesn't really talk about, while you're in there, you had it to enter, you entered, and now they're handing you off. Yeah, there's a lot of details maybe I would want, but if they are, I don't know, I think you're fine. So this has happened to me numerous times. that's why I think that it's okay, because I've never gotten in trouble for this. But North Little Rock Airport is in Arkansas, right? And it's North Little Rock is right underneath the Class Charlie for Little Rock, for LIT. And while you're doing the approach into North Little Rock, at some point along that approach, while you're in the Class Charlie, ATC will say, radar services terminated, frequency change approved. And they want you to start talking to North Little Rock so you can make your CTAF calls. And sometimes when they give you that call out, you are still in the Charlie. Now, while I'm doing those approaches, it's really common for me to get the added instruction of maintain current squawk until on the ground. And so that kind of clarifies it, because it's like, oh, I'm not having verbal communication, but I at least have my squawk code and they've identified me. And I think, ATC, again, could correct me here, but the whole purpose of maintaining two-way radio communication, establishing that, is they talk to you, they verify that you are where they think you are based on your radar, and they make sure that your altitude is reporting correctly. Once they've done that, they've got your three-dimensional fix, and your little target on their radar screen is now positively identified. So if you lose comms at that point, or they hand you off to a different frequency, they still know, hey, you verified your altitude and position. That's who they say that they know where you're at. Because the problem here is, like, somebody's in the Class Charlie that hasn't talked to you. You don't know where they're out vertically because you just see a primary target. You don't know their altitude. They could be at 3,000 feet. They could be at 10,000 feet over the Charlie. You don't know. So that's why that two-way communication is really important. So I don't think that's a problem there. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. It happens in Providence every single time where you're going back to the airport and it's like, oh, squawk VFR, frequency change approved. See ya. And they're like, oh, okay. We're like not even halfway through the Charlie, but this is what we're doing.
Yeah. All right, Jaeger. Sorry, I skipped over Jaeger's comment here. So he had the question about common carriage that sent me down that rabbit hole. He's just really wanting to get me to talk about this more. I'm nervous. Jaeger? Anyway, he said, you also really cleared up private carriage for me. I'm still fuzzy on common carriage operations. It seems many pilots fly for lots of different operators, seeming that they have many different contracts. For example, Gulfstream required 2 pilots. The operator sends one to pilot school for training on a new Gulfstream, while the other stays behind to continue flying. They call and find a new pilot to fly. I'm assuming some pilot can pick up a lot of different flights doing this. I read somewhere that the FAA could see 3 contracts as common carriage. Can you clarify on this? Oh, yes, I can. I need to do a whole podcast on this. So here's another reason why, and I've left it up on the screen share. Maybe that was serendipitous here. So let's go back to my favorite AC to hate, 12012A. Where you're getting the three contracts is in 12012A. And let's see, the guidelines, holding out. So it defines holding out sort of there very terribly. Right here, a carrier operating pursuant to 18 to 24 contracts has been held to be a common carrier. Okay, so that's in paragraph D. And then later on, I think it's in paragraph H or something, it says as little as 3 could be as common. So there's 3 numbers that it gives in this AC, and I don't want to read it again because it just makes me mad. 18 to 24 and 3. Those are the numbers of contracts. But again, everyone, a lot of people, including yourself, sounds like, thinks that 12012A is talking about pilots. It's not. It's talking about operators. So an operator cannot have a private carriage contract with more than 3 different businesses or entities, right? A pilot, the FAA does not care. First of all, they don't care if you have a contract, period, as a pilot for pilot services, right? Pilot services is totally different than operator, holding yourself out as an operator. Hopefully that makes sense, right? If I hold myself as an operator, I'm offering the plane and the pilot. I'm offering transportation from point A to point B. If you hold yourself out as a pilot, you're not offering transportation. You're offering your skills as a pilot to fly an airplane. That's what you're offering. So you can hold out, right? You can legally hold out as a pilot, right? Advertise the fact that you're a pilot and that you're willing to fly for people. You can do that. You cannot, without an operator certificate, hold yourself out as an operator to offer full transportation services. You can't do that. But you can hold out as a pilot. if you couldn't do that, how in the world would you ever get a job, right? Let's think about that. There's a job out there that you want. And let's agree that there's nowhere in the FARs that say you can't hold yourself out unless there's a job opening. No, that FAR doesn't exist. So there's a job out there that you really want. If you go and apply for that job, you are literally holding yourself out. You're holding out a resume and saying, hey, please hire me. I want to fly your airplane. If holding out was illegal for everybody, like pilots would be some sort of secret society. Like, how would we ever get a job? We couldn't tell anybody that we're a pilot because that could be holding it. That's because you're misinterpreting it. Not just you. I think 90% of pilots are probably misinterpreting this, and they're assuming that they, I've had pilots so twisted up in a commercial check ride that they think if they have a business card that says that they're a commercial pilot, they're in violation of the FARs. That's just not the case, right? You can tell people you're a pilot. You can apply for jobs. You can have a business, and the example that you're giving there, that's called being a contract pilot, right? There's a whole career field that people make a living on being a contract pilot. You can fly for 100 different operators, right? It doesn't matter. You can have contracts, as many contracts as you want, because just think the AC 12012A, it doesn't give a time limit on the said contracts. So is that lifetime? Like if it was talking about a pilot, it would have to give some sort of like a calendar year or lifetime. Like how would that work? Like I can work 3 different jobs, but as soon as I work for 4 jobs, I'm breaking the law. So I better get to the airlines by job 3 or I'm going to be, out of luck. So no, it's not talking about pilots. It's talking about private operators or private carriage operators, which is a Part 135 certificated event. And so what that means, let's say I have a 135 and Business A contracts me. I now have a private carriage. So I'm a 135, so I can do on-demand charter services, but I'm not a common carrier, so I can't advertise my services to everybody. I can only work with that one company. Well, then another company approaches me and they want charter services. So I start doing on-demand flying for company B over here. So now I'm flying for 2 different companies. I can't hold myself out I'm not a common carrier. I can't hold myself out to the public, just those 2 companies. Well, then company C comes to me and they want services. So now I'm doing private contracts with company A, company B, and company C. As an operator, right? I'm providing them full transportation services with a fleet of aircraft and pilots, all that stuff. I'm operational control, all that. That the FAA is talking about, saying now you're getting to cross the line where you're becoming a common carrier, and we need to change your ops specs to be a common carrier rather than a private carrier. That's what it's talking about, not pilot contracts. Katie says, if I decide to make more content about commercial operations in the future, I'm here for it. Man, I don't know. We'll see. This YouTube video is going to drop in a few weeks, and we'll see if I get fired as a DPE. Maybe I'll have to make content. There's no other way for me to make money. We'll see. There will be more content about commercial operations. There's a lot of questions. Okay, it has been an hour and 38 minutes, so I'm going to have to call it quits there. If you have questions that I didn't answer, go to our Discord. You can ask questions there all week long. I'm on there. We have a group of really good CFIs that are just doing a phenomenal job of answering questions on there, and they give you references. And then I'm busy, so sometimes I don't get to it right away. Sometimes I'll just give them the old thumbs up saying, hey, that's exactly how I would have said it. But I'll try to get on there and give references and interact as well. So if you like this type of content and you have a lot of questions, join the Discord. We're all there to help each other out. So I really look forward to interacting with y'all there. I really appreciate y'all watching this. And if you stayed for an hour and a half, wow, that's awesome. If you're listening to podcasts, don't forget to like and subscribe on YouTube. Give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. I'm trying to load videos on Spotify as well. That was a comment that came out a few episodes ago, so I'm trying to do that. But anyway, I'll see y'all next week. Thank you so much. We'll see you later.